There are two kinds of history. Official history, the kind which is taught in schools. Then there's secret history, a scandalous kind of history which explains how things really happened. This is the story of Australia's secret history. ASIO is Australia's leading intelligence agency, set up to identify spies and subversives who threaten the state from within. It has opened files on hundreds of thousands of citizens, creating a unique history of dissent. These files are dark biographies in which all suspects are guilty. Our series tells a few of the stories from the previously secret intelligence files of these persons of interest.
ASIO Q report, Gary Edward Foley, Aboriginal activist in Sydney, has extremist tendencies.
When white men arrived in this country, they either shot the blacks, poisoned their water holes, murdered them left, right and centre, and those that were left were rounded up like dogs and cattle.
Secret, sources comment. I consider Foley would be capable of violence.
Concentration camps. And there they stayed.
It was the end of the 60s and the world was on fire. Gary Foley was a new breed of political activist, reaching maturity and creating the most turbulent years of the late 20th century. The push for racial equality was too slow for this young generation. For Indigenous people, a tide of anger was rising.
We need land rights and we need it now.
ASIO saw world communism behind this push for freedom. The Communist Party of Australia was one of the few organisations which supported equality for Aborigines.
There were many Aboriginal people, especially in the 50s and earlier, who had joined the party, partly because the only political party in Australia until 1972 that ever supported Aboriginal rights was the Communist Party.
The Communist Party was a leading fighter in a whole number of new areas, in the fight against the Vietnam War, in women's social liberation, in support of the Aborigines.
ASIO was only ever really interested in what our connection with the Communist Party was. They wanted to know if we were being manipulated by the communists. None of us younger generation were really interested in becoming a communist. We saw ourselves first and foremost as Aboriginal nationalists, if you like.
The story of Gary Foley is about a changing of the guard. ASIO's files of the day record issues which were regarded as subversive and radical then, but today are accepted and mainstream. But the infamy of those days sits quietly still in the vaults of ASIO.
I grew up in Nambucca Heads. Moved to Sydney when I was 16 after I got kicked out of school. Ended up in Redfern. Met up with a lot of other young blackfellas like me. We became part of what became known as the Black Power movement.
Extract, Commonwealth Police Force. If violent Black Power type activities should erupt in the New South Wales Aboriginal community, it is believed that the following persons would be the main instigators: Paul Thomas Coe, Gary Edward Foley, Gordon Briscoe. To Brisbane, Sydney and Victoria. An article in the Sunday Australian inferred the establishment of an Australian Black Panther party formed by a number of radical Aborigines. The following persons were described as field marshals: Gary Foley, Paul Coe, Dennis Walker, Billy Craigie.
We got a phone call one day from a young reporter called Simon Townsend. He said he was interested in writing a story about Black Power in Australia. We said, sure, come over to Bondi, come over to the pub, shout us a few drinks and we'll tell you all about it.
These guys were modelling themselves on the American Black Panther movement, and they were saying very violent things about killing people, blowing up buildings, doing damage, assassinations and stuff.
We spun him this story about where the headline came from. We've only got a small amount of explosives at the moment, so we thought we'd save it for something useful. Little did we realise, the following Sunday was splattered this headline, you know. Looking at my ASIO file, I think that's where they sort of really started to get serious and think that we were some sort of terrorists.
What were you before the white man named you a Negro? And where were you? And what did you have?
People we were learning about was Huey P. Newton and the existence of the Black Panther Party.
The Black Panther Party are practical revolutionaries. We identify with the armed struggle of colonized people throughout the world. My attorneys must put much pressure on the authorities here to give me a book, quotations from Chairman Mao, a couple of other books. But yes, it's a Marxist-Leninist program.
The paranoia about the Aboriginal people getting involved in any sort of radical activity was bad enough, but the Black Panthers, from the point of view of Australian security officials, seemed to have been the worst possible case scenario.
ASIO or ASIO members would prick their ears up whenever they heard of mentions of Black Power activities in the United States, but ASIO didn't really follow those overseas movements. ASIO was this naive, isolated, out-of-date organisation that couldn't have appreciated any of those overseas developments anyway.
About the same time as I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, I'd received a pretty bad flogging from the New South Wales Police, and the combination of those two things had the effect of instantly politicising me. Paul Coe said to me that he was setting up a group to try and do something about the police harassment and intimidation of Aboriginal people in Redfern, and I didn't need to be asked twice.
Adapting ideas from the Black Panthers in America, they set up a breakfast program for kids, the Pig Patrol reporting police harassment, and established the first Aboriginal legal and medical services, and the National Black Theatre.
It was organisations such as the National Black Theatre and the Aboriginal Legal Service across the road and the Aboriginal Medical Service that ASIO seemed to take a particular interest in. A particular interest mainly because these were organisations that had been created by the Black Power movement.
And we're not going to stop until every last white racist pig and every white racist in this country has had a good kick in the head. The time of pacifism is gone.
Evaluation B, credibility 3. Alan was discussing with Newfong and Foley plans for the blowing up of the ship Endeavour. He stated that he already had several people who were trained and prepared to do the job. The words divers and gelignite were used several times.
I mean, who was the person who was making that allegation? Some dodgy character. I can honestly sit here and look you in the eye and say, I was never involved in any plot to blow up the Endeavour.
One of ASIO's agents was Tom Shepherd, a university student who had volunteered to help his country.
Agents would gild the lily just to make themselves interesting and feel that they're fulfilling what their handlers required, because again of this constant pressure of there must be something else. It doesn't matter what it is. It may be true, it may be untrue, but it's better that we know about everything that you have heard, seen, and then we'll decide what to use and what not to use.
If this was the first time this information had been presented, I wouldn't be acting on it immediately. I would be looking for more information to confirm this. And I would be looking at what sources we could, or resources we could deploy against this target to flesh out what's alleged here.
Allegations like that made 30 years or 40 years ago that were never proven and were never shown to have any substance whatsoever still remain on my ASIO file.
The Hope Royal Commission in the 1970s had recommended that factual errors in ASIO files be deleted as soon as possible. Yet 40 years later, unfounded allegations of a plot to blow up the new Endeavour remained.
The Black Caucus consists of Chicka Dixon, Paul Coe and Gary Foley. There are 3 or 4 other members. I gather that meetings of the Black Caucus are held somewhere in Redfern.
The Black Caucus in Redfern ran such a tight inner circle that it was impossible for ASIO to infiltrate it, because ASIO pointed out that the only way you could be part of the inner circle of the Black Caucus in Redfern was A, to be Aboriginal, and B, to be known to the other Aboriginal members of that group, and you needed to be known very well.
Though ASIO couldn't penetrate the Black Caucus, the same was not true of the Communist Party of Australia. Every phone call was recorded, visitors noted, and a network of agents reported back to ASIO. Even simple things became part of the grand communist conspiracy.
I asked Noel Hazard, who was the photographer for the Communist Party newspaper, The Tribune, to teach me how to develop photos in a darkroom. I'd seen him taking photos of demos. He was a nice guy. I wanted to learn that trick and asked him to teach me. So he said, come into the Tribune darkroom and I'll teach you all about processing photos. And then in my ASIO file, what turns up is this. A surveillance photograph of me leaving the Communist Party headquarters in Sydney, and ASIO got quite excited by this because I'm pretty sure that they saw this as some sort of proof of the great Black Power communist plot, when in actual fact all I was doing was going in and learning how to process photos.
In fact, Foley's relations with the Communist Party revealed underlying friction.
Gary Foley visited Communist Party headquarters to ask for financial assistance for the striking Aboriginal cotton chippers at Weewar. Foley stated quite bluntly that he was not interested in white workers. Palmada rejected Foley's In regard to his request for funds, the committee discussed the Intercept report. Foley contacted Joyce Stevens at the Communist Party. Foley said that he wanted some more chauffeuring and said that the matter was extremely and utterly, totally young communist movement. Speaker Gary Foley. There were only 3 young men and 2 young girls and Lynn Rendell present. The speaker did not turn up.
Much of the information about the Black Caucus was second-hand, gathered through penetration of the Communist Party. The only other way ASIO had of understanding what was happening in Black Australia was through Barry Dexter, head of the Department of Aboriginal Affairs. Dexter became a target for Foley and his colleagues as he passed increasingly serious allegations to ASIO.
I considered it my duty to reply to any queries they might make about an individual.
If we have to go about violent means of getting the power to control our own destinies, then we will. We're quite prepared to.
Secret. Mr. Dexter has stated his preference for an arrangement whereby he has not passed any classified information in writing. He prefers an arrangement whereby either he visits regional office to examine the material himself, or, alternatively, material is taken to him for his immediate perusal and returned by hand of an ASIO officer.
He was the head of the Department of Aboriginal Affairs at probably the most volatile time in, Australian history in terms of Aboriginal stuff.
Let me turn, first of all, as a first question, Mr. Dexter, to you as head of the Aboriginal Affairs Department. Do you think you should be replaced in your job by an Aborigine?
I would like nothing better.
Get out! Get out! Get out! Get out!
Black Power demanded self-determination, and black organisations run by whites now became a target.
At 4:30 a.m, a police patrol found that the glass doors of the Foundation for Aboriginal Affairs, 810 George Street, Sydney, had been smashed with a brick. The words "Kill Whitey," "Black Power," and various obscenities had been painted over the front of the building.
Whenever we felt like getting a little bit of public attention, you could always be guaranteed to get a headline. If you bought a can of paint down here to Hyde Park in Sydney and chucked it over Captain Cook here.
He was regarded as the original invader, We regarded those as fairly harmless, which they were, I mean, you know, compared to some of the things some people were doing. And yet they still had the effect of, to a certain extent, alienating us from some of the older generation of Aboriginal political activists, some of the more conservative older generation who'd been more into the tactics of Martin Luther King. I mean, I think that the only difference between the Black Power movement and an Aboriginal activist who'd been there before us was just in terms of the shock tactics that we were prepared to use. We were the generation that come along and said, we demand the right to self-determination, the right to control our own affairs, and that to us was what Black Power meant.
We're going to continue confronting white racist institutions wherever they may be found.
And yet this seemed to generate enormous fear and loathing in the broader community.
It was obvious this was no mere show of force. He was using all the power he could muster against the
We agreed with the basic line of the Black Panther Party. We only advocated that we were prepared to use violence to defend ourselves if necessary, and that we would never use violence unless we were attacked. And that was always our political philosophy.
All political questions and all political issues seemed to reduce down to one, and that was, are you with the communists or are you with us? From the trade unions to Indigenous rights, all of these were seen to be elaborate parts of a jigsaw in which the Communist Party was trying to create a revolution in Australia.
The anti-apartheid movement was seen as part of this communist conspiracy. Young white radicals, mainly middle class, were increasingly concerned about the racism in apartheid South Africa. Their whites-only sporting teams became the focus for protest.
Secret. Background brief, 16th April, 1971. Anti-apartheid campaign in Australia. The current campaign in Australia could eventually lead to a greater radicalisation of the Aboriginal rights movement.
Meredith Bergman was a middle-class girl from Sydney's North Shore who was radicalised by the Vietnam War and became prominent in the anti-apartheid movement of the early 1970s.
All that the anti-apartheid movement did was to wake up the young white radicals who were obviously interested in racism issues. I mean, the number of times we were lectured by, you know, Gary Foley and Paul Coe about, you know, why are you concentrating on apartheid when Aboriginal rights here are in such a bad state?
I think it was the time in history when the conditions were right for that sort of interaction.
Radical blacks were now joined by middle-class white kids. The cause of Aboriginal rights was energised and broadened, and the number of targets ASIO had to track grew and grew.
Communist Party interest in anti-apartheid movement. According to Mark Ahrens, there is a plan afoot for workers, students and trade unionists to invade the football pitch and to physically remove the goalposts whilst the game is in progress. Mark Ahrens has organised a meeting of communists to discuss the removal of the goalposts, how to achieve the polarisation of the crowd.
When the Springboks arrived in Sydney, police and the football authorities went to great extremes to try and keep their motel, the location of their motel, secret. But lo and behold, literally across the road from our black commune, the Squire Inn in Bondi Junction was where they installed the Springboks.
You know what? In the long run, I reckon we'd be better off with a more restrictive immigration policy.
Go home, racist! Go home, racist!
They were an integral part of that campaign and really the public face of it. Those pictures of two of them wearing the Springbok jerseys, they went all around the world. They were incredibly important images.
Intercept report. From the Communist Party of Australia on Monday, Hazard said Gary Foley, an Aborigine, had been cuffed by an official and when he objected was told in offensive language that he should expect this treatment if he hangs about with that type of people. Aaron said that Meredith Bergman had just been sentenced to 2 months hard labour without the option for running onto the field. To headquarters from Sydney. A total of 30 arrests were made on 7th of August 1971. The following are recorded. Mark Lawrence errands, unseemly words. Lee Brown, assault police. Dr. Frederick Hollows, hand grenade in possession, offensive behaviour. Hollows to be indexed.
I'm not saying that people like Gary Foley wouldn't have talked about violence, but it would have been basically to give ASIO something to think about. I mean, they were very funny guys. They were very witty, intelligent.
Is it a crow? Is it the Flying Doctor? No, it's Supabong, strange visitor from a northern tribe who came to the city possessing powers far beyond those of mortal Kuris.
They knew what they were doing, and they also knew that the security agencies were pretty interested in them.
Land rights isn't a word, it's a living.
From the CPA premises, Freeney contacted Dennis Walker and asked if Walker could come down for the rally on Friday night. Foley said he managed to round up quite a few, but he was waiting for Freeney to say he had bail ready, otherwise Foley is going to pull them all out.
Dennis Freeney is one of the truly amazing characters from that era, you know, probably unheralded. There's no doubt of the contribution that he made in terms of assisting the Aboriginal land rights movement, in part because Freeney was at the time the editor of the Communist Party newspaper, The Tribune, and he was responsible for an enormous amount of very good reportage at that time.
Secret. On Friday, 3rd of December 1971, a march against racism was held in Sydney. A group of some 150 people, about 100 white and 50 black, had gathered in Chifley Square.
From the government offices looking down on the square, ASIO were waiting. ASIO surveillance revealed a broad cross-section of support for the march. Anti-apartheid protesters, unionists, Communist Party members, Gurindji activists, Black Panthers and Maoists. Images like this one, with Black Panther Dennis Walker associating with communist author Frank Hardy and Dennis Freeney, must have rung alarm bells.
ASIO Minute Paper, 22nd of December 1971. The attorney referred to the march against racism in Sydney, at which Lawrence Ahrens had been arrested. The attorney said he would like to discuss the whole question of Aborigines from the ASIO point of view. He was particularly concerned by the threats of violence to individuals, including the new Aborigine Senator, Neville Bonner.
It was possible to think that some of the preaching of violence went beyond dissent, and it was this area of proposed violence that was of interest to ASIO and to me. I had to make a judgment as to whether it was dinkum or whether it was hot air.
You would arrive late at functions or meetings, and you'd take down the number plates of all the cars that were around and just jot them down and generally just put them in your back pocket. You would take a lot of time with the handler going through recognising cars and recognising people at functions. You'd have 50 photographs or 100 photographs, and you had to recognise as many people as you can. A debriefing session to the handler was just done in a car. So you were sitting looking straight ahead, and you just rattled off what you had to rattle off. You gave over any documents that you had, And then money was transferred, and then you signed for the money in a name that they told you to sign. Generally, I'd never look at them, and I often wouldn't know what they looked like because I didn't want to suddenly, if they ever turned up anywhere, I didn't want to give a recognising look.
It was essential that ASIO had accurate descriptions of physique and character.
Because they don't know who everyone is, they actually describe people, and they describe you in the most terrible way, like has a high voice and pimples, you know. Description: height, 5 foot 3 inches to 4 inches, build slight, eyes blue, general, good suntan, looks cheap and untidy, smokes heavily.
Gary Foley's description says he has prominent teeth, but...
They got knocked out 28 years ago in a demo.
In my ASIO file, I read with horror and shock that my Auntie Glory, according to my ASIO file, she said that I was brainy but a reactionary. I was horrified to see her opinion in that respect.
ASIO identified me as someone who is involved in the supply of drugs to the deaf and dumb fraternity in Canberra.
I think that just about everybody who's got an ASIO file from those days, within those files are some of the most scurrilous and outrageous accusations made against people. And yet these, whatever the informers say, is often recorded verbatim and left on the files as a note, and is still there today in many instances. It's a scandal.
Inward message, priority. 3 Aborigines from Sydney intend to sit on lawns under a beach umbrella until proper land rights given to Aborigines.
Invasion Day, Australia Day, 26th of January 1972. The Prime Minister, Billy McMahon's statement that day, which effectively declared that the McMahon government would never grant Aboriginal people land rights. 4 guys drove to Canberra on the night of the 26th and set up a protest on the lawns of Parliament House. The extraordinary thing was that when the police arrived, we expected these guys to just be arrested that night and hauled away, except that the police, when they arrived, informed these guys that they'd accidentally found a loophole in Canberra law, whereby it was not illegal to camp on the lawns of Parliament House. And as long as they only had 11 tents there was nothing the police could or would do, and the policemen got in the car, drove away. Hence the embassy was able to stay there, to the excruciating embarrassment of the Prime Minister and the government across the road.
ASIO investigated immediately. The next day, ASIO's Canberra office asked for any record of the squatters in the security files.
They weren't targets per se because of the issue. They were targets because of their possible use by foreign powers.
ASIO, outward message. To Canberra from headquarters. Your DIR refers to a visit made by Skulkin to Aborigine Embassy. Could you please supply any dates that any other member of Soviet embassy staff may have visited the area, and pray see their activity whilst there. Confidential. Many Aboriginals arrived armed with knives, and one Aboriginal named
Gary Edward Foley was in possession of a pistol. I mean, espousing armed revolution is not the same thing as walking around with guns. I know that sounds a bit weird, but it's an easy thing to say at a time when, you know, armed revolutions were happening all over the world. The Vietnamese people were about to kick the arse of the Yanks. We maybe romantically at times thought we ought to do a bit of that here, and we might have said some of that sort of stuff.
When we go out there, you don't know how to build a fucking Molotov cocktail. Burn the bloody things down.
But in practical terms, we all knew that there was no point in us arming ourselves and seeking to have a revolution. There were so few of us that they could have wiped us out in about a day and a half.
I've always been a great advocate of you got the capacity to do it. Have you got capacity? Now, some people won't take that. Some people want to argue that point, that, you know, just saying those words is enough. But I'd argue you have to go to the next step and say, well, do you have a gang who do it? Or do you have a gun? Would you go and do it? Or are you just saying you would? Or have you got 500 followers? So to me, capacity is always important.
Black Power's lack of capacity would not stop Attorney General Greenwood in his last months in government from attempting to frighten white voters with the spectre of black violence.
ASIO Minute Paper, 23rd of December 1971. The Attorney-General was emphatic that violence might flow from the developments in this field. He stated that he was not satisfied with some assessments which argued that no major acts of violence were likely to occur. The Attorney-General would be prepared to approve other telephone interceptions.
Increasingly desperate, the files show that the Attorney-General would do whatever it took to create a threat of violence. Leader of the Labor opposition, Gough Whitlam, made it clear that he and his party supported land rights.
We ought to accept in Australia the principle that there can be community ownership of land.
With support mounting for land rights, the concept of a moratorium for black rights based on the successful Vietnam protests was born.
General meeting of the anti-racist movement. Dennis Freeney took the floor and started to talk on the moratorium for black rights. Foley told him to sit down and shut up and let someone else have a few words to say. Gary Foley, Chicka Dixon and Paul Coe formed the Black Caucus and chaired the meeting. Agent comments. Gary Foley would like to think of himself as the leader of the group. He loves to talk. The Australian contacted Dennis Freeney. Freeney said they were only just starting to build up momentum in Sydney. But they had a flag.
From one beach umbrella grew the single most important action in the struggle for black rights, the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. In desperation, the government changed the law regarding camping on the grass.
ASIO inward message for headquarters from Canberra. On 17th July, ordinance which will give police authority to remove Aboriginal embassy will be gazetted. Residents will be given a week's grace to quit. If there is a leak, there may be increased support for moratorium.
ASIO's concerns proved irrelevant. The moratorium for black rights drew a large crowd which blocked the centre of Sydney. ASIO officers mingled with the protesters. In the crowd were some of Sydney's most well-known photographers, and some of the least known. ASIO's photographers, dressed as photo enthusiasts, also recorded the event. They trawled the crowd and also sought out well-known communists. Numbers were written on the photographs of those who already had a file, including this old lady and the two children. Standing on the corner of George and Bathurst Streets, this photographer captured everyone as they passed the lens. Most have ASIO files.
Headquarters, ASIO. Moratorium for black rights. The following persons were noted by ASIO officers as being present. Eric Ahrens, Brian Ahrens, Faith Bandler, Bill Brown, Pat Clancy, Gary Foley, Dennis Freeney, Sekai Holland, Claude Jones, Jack Mundy, Reverend Ted Knopfs, Joe Palmada, Lynette Rendell.
In December 1972, the Australian Labor Party was swept to power in a federal election, and major changes began for Aborigines and the land rights movement. ASIO was warned off surveillance of many of its former targets by new Attorney General Lionel Murphy. Yet allegations of weapons and potential violence seemed to grow.
Department of Aboriginal Affairs, confidential. Firearms, Aboriginals. For some time now, officers of the consultation section have expressed concern at the numbers of young Aboriginals that are gaining or have gained access to firearms, pistols, automatic rifles and shotguns.
The greater part of this document was actually originally written by one of the senior Aboriginal officers in the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, a man by the name of Reg Saunders, a legendary Australian war hero. At the time that Reg Saunders wrote the original version of this document, I was living in his house with his youngest daughter, Hilary. He was effectively my father-in-law at the time. And I was quite surprised and taken aback 30 years later when I read that Reg could have written such a thing about me at a time when I was living in his house.
Well, wondering when you and Christian were thinking of getting married.
Marriage? Chris and me don't need any white reactionary middle-class ideas like marriage. I spit on marriage. We're gonna go on living together until I take her to Mozambique and we join the black guerrilla forces there and we both fight until we die.
After living in Reg's house for a week, I mean, Reg was a military man, remember? After a week of living in Reg's house, he said to me one day, he said, don't you think it's about time you got a job, son? And I said, oh, yes, yeah, I suppose you're right. And he got any ideas? And he said, come into the department on Monday.
Restricted to headquarters from Brisbane. Special Branch have advised that Gary Edward Foley has been appointed to a position with the Department of Aboriginal Affairs in Canberra.
I think I lasted 6 weeks, and I was employed as a journalist in the Public Relations and Information section of the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, where I found myself writing the propaganda.
Yes, Gary was the only person I ever sacked in my 35 years of service. One of my officers, an Aboriginal, has reported to me that he had heard talk there of an intention to blow up the MLC Tower in Woden. The names he had heard associated with the affair included Gary Foley and Paul Coe
of the New South Wales Aboriginal Legal Service. I'm informed that Mr. Foley rang the manager of the MLC Tower last week and pressed him strongly to indicate when the automatic locking arrangements on the fire stair doors would be taken off. This would seem to indicate some intention to do something, even if it is only to return to the department to assault those persons to whom Mr. Foley took a dislike during his short period as a temporary officer of the department.
I had never heard anything about this until the day about 3 years ago when I read my ASIO file and saw this in there. I would suggest to you that there was a lot of paranoia around about this time, and this is a classic example of that sort of paranoia. I mean, the Department of Aboriginal Affairs was never blown up. None of us were even questioned about it, so somebody obviously didn't take this as seriously as what Mr. Dexter did.
Confidential, March 1974. Information had been received concerning a possible threat to the life of the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Senator Kavanagh. The Commissioner of the Commonwealth Police reported that he had received advice from the Secretary of the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, Mr. Dexter, that 3 Aborigines had arrived in Canberra for some unspecified but apparently nefarious purpose, and it was thought that the most likely object of their attentions would be Senator Kavanagh or Mr. Dexter.
I was under 24-hour-a-day police guard for 2 years, and the children were pretty much upset to see the Commonwealth Police constantly at the front of the house and accompanying me wherever I went. So that was the main disadvantage from my point of view, but I felt it was necessary to play this double role.
ASIO Minute Paper. During a meeting with the Prime Minister, the question of activities in support of Aboriginal rights was discussed. The Prime Minister expressed his view that it should not be a function of national security to monitor the political actions of those who were fighting for Aboriginal rights. The exception to this, he said, would be where foreign influences were involved. In the case of Aborigines, he cited the example of a group who recently visited China. He said that if, after their return, it was apparent that they were acting on a Chinese brief, this would warrant the attention of this organisation.
I went to China in 1974 because Chicka Dixon asked me to lead the second delegation of Aboriginal people to go to China.
The Chinese government had already invited American Black Panthers to visit, and tours by Australian radicals followed soon after. ASIO kept track of them as they passed through airports, border crossings and consulates. All interviews and press coverage were carefully examined for signs of subversion.
Once I got there, I was interested in certain aspects of what was going on in China. Various forms of communes that we visited and saw in China. As part of our philosophy of land rights, we were trying to develop ideas of how to politically and socially organise communities that could become self-sufficient and self-sustaining, and do so in a way where all the Aboriginal community progressed together rather than an entrepreneurial individual elite of managers who became rich at the expense of everybody else.
So if you're ever doing anything nefarious, don't use your cell phone, don't use your email, don't use any other electronic gadget. Go and talk to the person. Or you make one phone call, an innocuous phone call to make a meeting. With these people, when you had the meeting, you always organised the next meeting so you didn't have to call them. And if for some reason you couldn't make that meeting, there was always an emergency contact or an emergency phrase or something. But you always tried to make the next meeting at that meeting, so you just reduced the number of times you actually had to talk to them on the telephone.
This relates to a telephone intercept that ASIO did on a conversation between myself and a young woman in Brisbane. And in this conversation, I say that I'm coming up to Brisbane tomorrow night, and I'm asking her if she'd like to go to Gympie with me. I'm on my way to Gympie.
You've got to think of it as information. What we get, people call it intelligence. It's not. It's information which we turn into intelligence. So what you do, you've got your target. You know things about your target. So you start getting all this information from all these sources in. Telephone intercept, listening devices.
So ASIO immediately assumed that because this woman was involved in a group of the Communist Party in Brisbane, here was potential evidence of some sort of plot between the communists and the Black Power movement.
Then you have to analyse it, and you have to pull it together to make a coherent story or form a coherent picture, which then becomes the intelligence, okay?
Purpose of the Gympie trip is still unknown. You know, they thought there was some sort of political conspiracy happening, when in fact, when I looked at this, I saw this woman's name and I thought, I remember her. And then I realised this wasn't about politics at all, folks. This was about sex. We were sneaking off. We were going to try and sneak off to Gympie together for a dirty weekend, and ASIO thought it was some sort of plot going on. Well, there was a plot going on, but not the sort that ASIO thought. So they didn't always get it right, folks.
I feel that the things that I did for ASIO were duplicitous, that I still don't know whether I'm lying or whether I'm telling the truth. I am socially a misfit at the moment. I have been since I finished work with them, and I'm suffering from those repercussions.
One of the interesting things about the ASIO files from a historian's point of view, they're a valuable archive of material that otherwise is not recorded in other places. And as such, especially if you're looking at them from your own personal perspective, I'm able to sort of piece together vast tracts of my life that have disappeared from my memory. So as in certain ways, some of the files are very good historical records and accounts that we may not have otherwise had. So in certain ways, ASIO has done us a bit of a service.
So there was always pressure from the handlers as well. Stay there. You'll find something. Something will come your way that will make this whole exercise well worthwhile. And we will always look after you. Yeah. They won't. And they haven't. And I'm not the only one.
I think that this really becomes a question of not being able to do everything yesterday. Sometimes it takes...
Oh, you'll still be talking like that when they shoot niggers down trying to protect their land. He'll still be talking like that. It's about time people woke up to what this guy is.
Hey,
Gary. How you going, mate?
How you going?
Not bad.
How's things?
Oh, pretty good.
You been getting out and about a bit since I last seen you?
Oh, yeah, I've been up to Sydney a few times and down to the
Go
coast.
on, you go out, mate.
Yeah.
Well, sit down.
Come on up.
I've been reading your manuscript, mate. It sort of shines lights on areas that were dark to me before, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
And I can see things probably a lot better, in a lot better perspective.
Oh, yeah, you thought I was a proper bastard, didn't you?
Yeah, but at the same time, we didn't want to kill you.
No.
I mean, did you really think that the communists were held any sway with us at that point?
Yeah, I guess we did.
Well, just because we had an association with people like Jack Money and Bob Pringle.
Yeah.
The communists had no chance of getting in on our inner circle any more than ASIO did. Did they have a file on you?
Yes. And I've tried to see it,
Aye.
but I have just learned that it was shredded.
Oh, there's got to be a copy in there somewhere. We should get it, Baz, and we can sit down and compare our ASIO files from both sides of the fence.
Yeah, no, I would love to have seen mine because
Aye.
there was a life before Aboriginal affairs. Back at the university, Melbourne University, I ended up vice president of the Labour Club.
Oh, yeah.
And the Labour Club was about as communist as you could get.
Well, there's the ultimate ironies in all this, isn't it? Two old commies.
Yeah, they didn't know that I was one when they asked me to take this on.
Well, obviously ASIO, well, neither did I. Otherwise we would have got on a lot better.
Oh,
I
don't think so.
Aye.
I think you'd have still given me a rough ride.
Apparently the white people on the North Shore resent the intrusion of large numbers of Aborigines to their little haven over here.
And that's how much your land rights mean.
There's a row of all the wild heads right behind me.
Yeah, including me.
Frost had actually invited the minister, who had been very disturbed by a report that he was going to be assassinated at the Frost show. He asked me to go instead. so I did.
In a sense, it sort of hurts me to think you thought we would want to kill you. To this day, nobody can pin anything on me of having ever done, you know, anything violent, except when you sack me, Bazza.
Serve you right.
Yeah, well, I mean, I concede after all those years, if I was you, I would have sacked me too. Like I said, it's not a question of mellowing. I think I've got a greater understanding and a greater appreciation now of how difficult it was for you in your situation. I think that Frost footage there, I think it was extraordinarily courageous of you to walk into a lion's den like that.
I was.
And am I the only person you ever sacked?
The only one ever.
I don't know whether to be proud of that or not. Because we were both caught up in the same web of history, you know, and in 50 years' time, you know, historians will be making lots of judgments about you, both you and me.
I am grateful for the fact that you and I got together I think that it's the way we always would have wished it.
Whoever would have thought that I'd be saying that my ostensible enemy in those days' perspective was neglected? But
Never,
it's true.
Never an enemy, that's too strong.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, adversaries, mate.
Okay, yeah, that's right.
But it's good to catch you after all these years.
And you, mate.
Do it this way, just to shock all of my mates. You old radical, you. It's a much less free world today in terms of security surveillance and security operations than it was in my day. And as I've said, you know, if I'd have said some of the things I said when I was 19, if I was saying that today, I'd probably be in an orange jumpsuit and rendered to Guantanamo Bay. But that's for the next generation of people with a conscience to worry about.